Good morning. We are learning that one touch of the God experience is worth more than many books of instruction about God. And we are at that point of the infinite way unfoldment where only the experience of God is going to benefit us or accomplish the work that is given us to do in revealing what the realization of the presence of God can do for others in their experience. Probably by now you have already come to agree that this world is living without a God. It is living not without a belief that there is a God. No. There are very few people who do not believe that there is a God. But that the world is living without a God. One can believe in the ability to reach the moon, but one cannot reach the moon at this particular moment. And even believing in it won't accomplish it. There must be an actual experience of bringing through those things that make for the possibility of such a trip. So it is, this whole world, or most of it, believes in God or believes there is a God. But very few people in the entire history of the world actually have a God, actually have the activity of God in their experience, actually have God at work in their affairs. Now, the reason is that all religious teaching except that part of it which has concerned itself with some work done in monasteries and convents, all religious work, so far as it pertains to the public, has had to do with thoughts about God, statements about God, teachings about God, rather than bringing about the experience of God to us as individuals. Now, it was the experience in the healing work that showed me conclusively that believing in God, or knowing about God, in fact knowing all the truth there is to be known about God, is of no spiritual value, although they may be steps leading up to spiritual demonstration. But I learned actually that it was only when a spiritual experience took place in me that a healing took place in the outer. And so it is that in the years that have gone by since, I have learned that as I have had a spiritual experience within, I have experienced something of harmony in the without, for myself and for others. Then, as time went on, I learned that continuing to have those moments of contact, of spiritual experience, that the day came which was a day of transition into the Spirit, and that after that it was a permanent experience. It wasn't one that had to be reestablished from time to time, although it has always been necessary at certain times to go within and go deeper than usual to bring about some effects. For instance, I could not have started talking this morning. There was just nothing there that wanted to be said. And so it became necessary just to go within. Now, at a certain point or depth of consciousness, all of a sudden an idea came through. That first idea was, the Lord is my shepherd. And then there was a complete relaxing inside. Because if the Lord is my shepherd, all is well. The sheep will come home and be well cared for. Now, that is all the more necessary in the experience of our students, that they realize that no matter how much truth they know, there still remains the need to go within and sometimes be very patient for minutes or even hours until that depth is reached which brings to light the needed presence and power realization of God. Now, several times the subject has been broached from others as to a need for a college or university of spiritual truth to train practitioners and teachers. And the answer to that is this: it is an impossibility. There is no way in any length of time of turning out a class of either practitioners or teachers, no matter how much time you allow, even a 5-year course, out of any 100 students whom you could teach for a period of 3 to 5 years, it would be very fortunate if you could turn out 2 or 3 practitioners and 1 teacher. And so you see the impossibility of ever having such a college or university. Teaching must always be an individual experience. You can have class instruction, but you may have to have a student for 20 classes before the spiritual depth of them would be plumbed and the spirit begin to flow. On the other hand, out of 100 who would go through 20 classes, you would find very few who even at the end of that time would have been opened enough to really be a practitioner or a teacher. Healing and teaching come only through spiritual consciousness, and that spiritual consciousness must be aroused in one before the work can be undertaken. Now, we are here for one purpose. Having had years and years of study and preparation and some measure of demonstration, we are seeking that experience, that opening of the inner spiritual consciousness that will enable our very presence to be a healing influence and a teaching influence. It isn't necessary to have any diplomas or any licenses. The moment a person's spiritual center has been opened, all those prepared to recognize it do recognize it and seek it. Now, with the background that we have had in study, meditation, practice, and the fact that we have agreed that all of that can only be a preparation for the experience itself, for an actual inner contact, our attention now is not on learning more truth, merely continuing to be aware of the simplicity of truth, remembering the major points of it occasionally, but abiding more in the spirit than in the letter. One student says that if she were to explain what's going on in her thought, people would think that she were back in orthodoxy again. That is the point you come to in this work, that after you have been through much of this knowing of simple truth and deep truth and spiritual truth and all forms and expressions of truth, you come right back to your childhood days and merely say, the Lord is my shepherd, I have nothing more to think about. The Lord is my shepherd, and all the weight drops off, and all of this deep truth isn't necessary anymore. The realization has taken its place, and as the Master brought out, truth is so simple that babes can understand it. Yes, because a babe, an infant, a child, can say, the Lord is my shepherd, with an absolute inner conviction that there is something greater than itself. An adult couldn't do that. An adult always has some mixture of, well, I'm pretty good too, mixed up in it, until they have been through all of these stages of metaphysics and spiritual wisdom, and then arrived at the place where, oh, what you're trying to say is that the Lord is my shepherd. Why didn't you say that in the first place? But now, at this stage, the very moment you have had an experience, you will find that it is literally true, that the very simplest expressions of truth are the deepest. Thy grace is my sufficiency. There's nothing more orthodox than that statement, but neither is there anything more spiritually profound than that statement. After you have been through all the stages of the deep metaphysics and come back to, oh yes, now having had the experience, I know that thy grace is my sufficiency. All the rest then is wiped out. It is like a question in a recent letter as to whether the Lord God and the Jehovah God and 3 or 4 other kinds of God all are the same God. My answer was, how do I know? There's only one thing which I really know. Only one thing. I know that God is. Whether he's Lord God or Jehovah God or Christ God, I don't know, or Buddha God. I don't know anything about those things. I merely know that God is. That has come to me with such a deep inner conviction that even though I missed the way on the way, I still must affirm there is a God. God is. And God is at hand, closer than breathing, nearer than hands and feet. That I'm aware of. Any lack of demonstration on my part would never change the fact that I have and always know God is. Now, I don't pretend to know what God is or how God operates. I'm perfectly satisfied for God to have all the different names that all the different religions give to it, as long as in my own heart and soul I will admit that it doesn't make any difference. The only one thing that counts, God is. And God is an omnipotence, God is an omniscience, God is an omnipresence, and because of that, the rest is of no consequence. The same way, do we know that I and the Father are one? I have never met anyone that knows that. Never. Always there seems to be a separate entity or identity called Joel. And as I look out there, I see separate entities called Bill, Mary. And in the face of that, I say, I and the Father are one. And then I know, of course, that it may be true, but I can't say that I know that. And yet, when I am in the depths of that God experience, then I know it. Then I know it, because then I know who I am and where I am and what I am appearing as. And it's a far different thing than that which I see in a mirror. You catch glimpses of that. Well, I had one day out here when I was giving this lawn a very thorough wetting, and I could almost feel the water going through the grass. It was as if I were being fed. It was as if I were receiving that nourishment from that water. The grass and I were one. I couldn't say outright the grass and I are one, but I had the feeling that as that water soaked into the grass, that actually that I was being fed. That water was doing as much for me as for the grass, if we were separate things. And I've heard Don Blanding say that he doesn't like to see a flower cut off from the bush because somehow he feels the cut. I can understand that. I can understand that, because that is a revelation that Walt Whitman had, this oneness. And when you feel yourself to be a blade of grass or a flower, then anything that happens to it happens to you too. And another mystic has brought out that everything that happens to anyone on the street is actually happening to us if we but knew it. Now, those aren't things that can be said or known with the intellect. You can repeat them because Walt Whitman said them, or Don Blanding experienced them, or Joel Goldsmith had it, but that's a far thing from feeling it, realizing it, and living it. The living of it comes with the experience itself. Now, in our meditations, and more particularly in your meditations at home, give more concern to the experiencing of God than to thoughts about God. If necessary, say to yourself, nothing that I could think about God is true. God isn't truth. Rather, my thoughts aren't truth. God is truth. Words aren't truth. My thoughts aren't truth. God is truth. So therefore, let me stop thinking and declaring and experience truth. You see, truth is an experience, but truth isn't something separate and apart, or truth isn't an objectified thing that you can be here and know, because that would be two. And so it is, even though in our sessions here there's more talking than there should be, only because it seems vital to bring these different points to light. In our meditations, there should be longer periods of realizing that this truth that I'm thinking, this truth that I'm knowing, this truth that I'm reading, isn't really the truth. It's only truth when I'm experiencing it within. And then be patient. Even though you meditate a few minutes and stop. Go back and meditate again a few minutes and stop. Go back and meditate again a few minutes and stop, until you do reach that point of experience, because that is what we're really waiting for. You see, just as we all know what the sunshine will do for our gardens, and therefore we build our gardens so as to get them into the sunshine where they can avail themselves of it, on a much greater scale, God can bring peace on earth. The actual demonstration of God can bring harmony and grace on earth. It isn't going to come there through changes of political parties. It isn't going to come there through human organizations, but it can be brought here by the specific and conscious realization of God. Every time we experience it, we are loosing God on earth. And that God goes before us, goes out into this world to do its mighty works. Without someone experiencing it, God is not on earth. In other words, there has to be a Jesus walking up and down the Holy Lands in order to bring the healing presence and power to the Hebrew race. There had to be a Moses before him. There had to be a Moses, or the Hebrews would still have been in their slavery in Egypt. It didn't have to be that particular man. It could have been somebody else with that same realization. There had to be a Mary Baker Eddy to restore spiritual healing to the world. It did not necessarily have to be the Mary Baker Eddy who lived in New England in the 1800s. But if it weren't she, it would have had to be some other she. There had to be a concrete woman on earth in order to restore, or man, to restore spiritual healing to the world, because there was none on earth at that particular time. And so far as we know, there would have been none now, because there hasn't been an original revelation since her day. Everyone has stemmed out from that basis of her original teaching. So far as we know, nobody on earth has been given the grace to restore spiritual healing to the earth in this age except Mary Baker Eddy. The rest have just stemmed out from that beginning, just as all of the Christian teaching stems out from Jesus Christ. Of course, after Jesus Christ, you have a John and you have a Paul, and then later on you have Fox and you have Luther and you have all the rest of these Western mystics. And but there is no indication that any of them would have brought this to light had there not been that particular unfoldment which was given to the world by Jesus Christ. So always there has to be Christ manifest as Jesus, or Christ manifest as John, or Christ manifest as Mary. There has to be an individual giving expression to Christ in order for Christ to be available to the world. Now then, when you are ill and turn for help, there has to be Christ manifest as a practitioner or teacher in human form in order for you to benefit by that, unless you are one of the very, very rare souls on the face of the globe who came here with direct contact with the source. There are some. There are not many. For the rest of us, it was necessary, when we were seeking help, that we find an individual sufficiently imbued with the Christ as to make our healing evident. And so it is that there are millions on earth today looking to us and to others like us, but they are not going to find healing unless they find individuals imbued with the Christ, so that the Christ and the individual have become one. Then, in that degree, does their healing take place. Well, so it is with the larger things of the world. There will have to be individuals all around this globe sitting down every single day in the actual experience of the Godhead or Christ, and thus loosing the spiritual power on earth just as they loose it in your individual experience for a healing. Now remember, Think back on any spiritual healing you have had from a practitioner, and remember that it was the degree of realized Christ in their consciousness that gave you your freedom. That's the secret of spiritual healing. The degree of realized Christ in the consciousness of one individual can give physical, mental, moral, financial freedom to thousands, tens of thousands. Now, so it is. The degree of realized Christ in your consciousness is the degree of harmony that is brought into your body, into your business, into your home, and into your community circle, friends, families. Not that everyone will be receptive and responsive to it. Oh, no. Jesus had to find out, sadly enough, that even some of his own disciples couldn't be receptive and responsive to the Christ. So let us not believe, nor could his mother, nor his brethren. So let us not believe for a moment that everyone who touches our life is going to be receptive and responsive to that Christ. But that isn't our function to care, whether it is our near relatives or friends, or whether it is strangers 10,000 miles away who are receptive. Our function is not to be concerned with who it is that receives the benefit of the Christ. Our concern is that we experience daily the Christ, loose it upon the earth, and let it do its work. Wonderful it is if our friends and relatives can all accept it, but if they can't, remember this: somewhere 1,000 miles away, 10,000 miles away, someone of whom you may never hear in your whole history will be receiving the benefit of that Christ. Some public meeting, some government official may be receiving the light from the Christ that you are experiencing in any given moment, so that never at any time in your life will you really know the extent of the good that is loosed on earth through your experience. It is never given anyone to know that. But peace on earth, improvement in labor and capital relationships, ultimately even the human relationships of family life and community life, all will be changed, not by any virtue of most of the people concerned who will be benefited, but by virtue of those few individuals who are willing to be servants of the Most High. And servants is a very good word, too. Those who are willing to sacrifice, if you might call it that, in the end you will find it isn't that, but give up time, effort, energy toward the actual experience of the Christ, so that you can say, I felt it. That's all. That's all. I felt the click. I felt the presence. That's all you need, because at that moment you have loosed the Christ on earth. You have let it escape from having been locked up within you until now it walks the earth. And it may well appear to some unfortunate on the street or in prison or in a hospital So I'm stressing, this is for all of our students, wherever they may be, that at this point of our unfoldment, it is necessary not only for our own good, but for the work that is given us to do in the world, that we understand ourselves to be a spiritual underground, that we understand that it is our function every day to realize the presence, power, activity of the Christ, realize the very feeling of the presence, and then let it go and be about its Father's business, wherever that may be, in whatever way. You can be assured of this, the Christ will overturn and overturn and overturn until he come, whose right it is, until justice appears on earth, until equity, fairness, integrity, until spiritual demonstration appears on earth. The Christ will overturn and overturn and overturn, and we won't always like that overturning because we will not always understand it. We will see forms of error that we will really believe to be error when in fact it is the Christ overturning. So it is our function to function as a spiritual underground, not merely for the benefit of our own lives, because our lives are relatively unimportant. Our lives at this particular point can't be of any importance in the human world. There is very little left for most of us of any human good that could come that would be of too much importance. So the only life we have to live now is a spiritual existence, which would certainly not be for our own good, but for whatever good could come through the realization of Christ on earth. You see, you cannot imagine the Master turning stones into bread because he was hungry. You cannot imagine the Master doing anything in his ministry for the purpose of adding name or fame or glory or riches to himself. Nor can you imagine anyone doing any of those things at this stage of our unfoldment. In other words, what is it that you individually want out of life? And if your answer is that you want something for yourself, then you are not listening to the message of the infinite way. The message of the infinite way is for us to bring to those who still want something of the earthly nature, to bring it to them. Better health, better supply, better employment, better marriage, whatever we can bring, but not because we care one iota whether or not they have it, but because it is an evidence of what the activity of the Christ can do in human experience. And so it may lead them to the point of experiencing all the human good and then saying, well, I too don't want any more of it. And then they join the ranks of those who say, what difference does it make whether I have the next 10 years or 15 years that are left to me of a human span, this way or that way, when I can devote my inner life at least to the realization of this Christ. This does not in any wise change our outer lives. Our outer lives are still lived as family men or family women. Our outer lives are still lived in the interest of our community. Our outer life does not change. In fact, it becomes intensified. I think, if anything, we become better neighbors and better citizens because we are not holding people in the condemnation even of their own conduct or thoughts. But while we continue to live the normal life on the outer plane, we have this separate inner life which no man knoweth. We take very seriously the Master's teaching that our prayers must not be done in public, that our prayers must be done sacredly and secretly in the inner sanctuary, and that we do not do our alms before men, that men may know about them. And so this is our particular form of alms, this spiritual awareness. And so we're not going to do it so that the world thinks that we are praying for it. No. We do it sacredly, but we do it secretly. And we do it within our own being while outwardly living as close to our normal lives as we can. Well, let us take up again this meditation. I was just struck like a bolt of lightning with this idea of not mistaking human good for spirituality, and not depending on external activities for the inner grace that produces harmony in our experience. Recently, a magazine came to me which had for its main theme the preservation of animal life, the idea of not destroying insects, the idea of not eating meat, not wearing furs. And of course, from a humanitarian standpoint, these are steps that many have to take to come to their spiritual awareness. And the objects in and of themselves certainly are fine. But the point that I make is this, that those who live in the Arctic may have a very difficult time surviving without the wearing of furs. But on the other hand, those in southern climates who don't wear furs haven't, by that means, enriched their spiritual development. In the same way, human thought at the present time requires meats in certain climates, more of it in some than in others, but it is a very simple matter to eliminate meat in the very hot climates without thereby adding any spiritual virtue to oneself. In other words, the mere fact that there may be very little meat or fish consumed in India or China does not necessarily mean that they have spiritually developed themselves. Now, the object of all this is good and is right. The day will ultimately come when all of us will find it unnecessary to live even humanly, even physically, by the flesh of animals. And we undoubtedly will find a substitute for leather shoes and even for furs. That will all come. And when it comes, it will come because of the spiritualizing process that is going on in consciousness, even as today, the closer you get to a feeling of spiritual sense, the less of meat you can eat, and sometimes reach the point of being unable to eat any at all. So that this outer improvement is a direct result of an inner spiritual grace. But the point that I would like you to see is that the giving up of the meat or the furs or the leather is not the development of the inner spiritual grace. But the development of the inner spiritual grace would bring about the giving up of these other on the outer plane. Now, the reason that this strikes me so forcibly this morning is this, that at every stage of our unfoldment we are apt to reach the temptation receive the temptation to believe that something we do or think in the human realm is going to help us in the development of our spiritual awareness, whereas this isn't so. The development of our spiritual awareness is what is going to improve us in the outer plane. To stop stealing, lying, cheating, or defrauding is not to make oneself spiritual, but to become spiritual would automatically end lying, cheating, stealing, defrauding. Now, the point then is not to accept the belief that there is some virtue in an outer thing, act of omission or commission, that some sacrifice will enhance us spiritually, or the indulgence of some form of outer human living will enhance us spiritually. Spirituality is developed within our own being through the very work that we have been engaged in for these many years, the reading of spiritual wisdom, the hearing of spiritual wisdom, and the associating with those on the spiritual path. Therein lies the development of our inner spiritual grace, and in proportion as this is attained, the conditions of mind, body, and purse all change. There again, you remember the other day, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. There is our goal, the attaining of the consciousness of the Spirit of the Lord, the attaining of the realization of God's presence. And that is accomplished through this type of work, and more especially as the meditations are increased in time and in depth. The inner spiritual light increases. Man does not live by bread alone. And of course, the Master was very clear on the fact that the Hebrews were entirely wrong in their system of sacrifices. Their sacrificing of animals, their sacrificing of money, their sacrificing of anything was a mistake, because the kingdom of God is not low here or low there. It is not to be found in doing this or not doing that. The kingdom of God is found by inner realization, not by an outer act of either omission or commission, but by an inner realization. Now, let us agree that there isn't a single thing in all of this world that can't be changed, adjusted, by a sufficient degree of depth to our meditation. Let us agree that an ordinary meditation will gradually dispel most of the discords and inharmonies from our existence, more especially those of a not too great degree of intensity. Let us further agree that a deeper meditation will meet some of the problems, many of the problems, that do not yield to the ordinary or lighter forms of meditation. Then let us further agree that the most intense form of error, the last enemy that shall be overcome, death itself, will yield to a degree of Christ realization which is deep, powerful, then you can see that you become master of your own fate. You become master of your own life, because it is the degree of God consciousness to which you attain that determines the degree of harmony in your outer experience. And so then it is you who determine whether or not there will be an hour here and there, or 2 or 3 hours, when the phone is cut off, when the front door is locked, when nobody is home to the external world, and when in which you are determined that I will contact this inner presence and power. I will get sufficiently still inside that it can take over and breathe through my lungs, live through my body, live my life's experience until I can say with Paul, I live, yet not I, Christ liveth my life. Now, Christ is the Spirit of God in man. And as the Master has told us, it is within you. But it is deep within you. The Master said the way is straight and narrow. Few there be that enter. Because these hundreds of generations of human experience have so far separated us from this inner contact that we cannot go back now easily and make the contact. And so it is that it takes patience on our part, endurance on our part, a determination, after that we have known that Christ is the answer to our problem, that we will stand by faithfully in our meditation until Christ, the activity of God in human consciousness, is touched. Now, if the realization of God becomes an important way of life to us, then of course what the world calls a sacrifice of time or effort isn't a sacrifice at all, but a pleasure, just as the years spent in studying music or art are not looked upon by the musician or artist as years of sacrifice, but rather years of devotion to the attainment of the gift. So with us, the gift we are seeking is the actual experience of Christ, the actual living in God. We live and move and have our being in God, do we? Certainly not. As human beings, we do live and move and have our being in God after that we have attained it, after that we have touched it. And so it is the years necessary to the study, the practice, the meditation, are not years of sacrifice, but years of devotion to that which is our goal in life. This would not apply to the student who has turned to truth merely for the solution of human problems. And that is why we do not speak this language to the student at that point when they are merely seeking a solution to their human problems. We speak rather on their level of consciousness, in the same way that the Master healed the sick, raised the dead, preached the gospel, gave them the Sermon on the Mount as a way of life, gave them the golden rule as a way of life. But To the disciples, he went further. He showed them the healing principle. He took them to the Mount of Transfiguration to show them the hidden mysteries of the spiritual universe. And he expected of them that they had left their nets, that they had left their human desires for human fulfillment, that they had left the goal of just money-making for money-making's sake, or fame for fame's sake, and that their whole heart and soul and mind was centered in the hidden mysteries. Now, you perhaps read in yesterday's newspaper here of this man who was visiting in Hawaii and who was interviewed, who was present at the opening of the manuscripts that were found in the Dead Sea. And as a matter of fact, those manuscripts are going to change the whole of the religious life of the world. Every church, Christian church, will have to change its teachings as a result of those manuscripts, because here are these manuscripts already authenticated by universities, by scholars, and revealing that much that the church is teaching isn't true, and showing where the mysteries of Christianity came from, and what their intent was, and what the mode of life was that came forth through these mysteries. Well, the Master knew from his previous experience that the attainment of the hidden mysteries, of the inner wisdoms, would make an individual forever free of dependence or reliance on external forms. That is how these Christian teachings came into being. Those who revealed them saw that it was no longer necessary to have a church, that a church was an individual's contact with the Master, and that it was something that took place inside one's own being, not inside of an edifice. And so these people formed a group outside of the church, and that is where the Christian life was lived. This movement outside was in the nature of a brotherhood, but one that was more or less loosely drawn and was entirely dependent on one's spiritual respect for one another. If you were an aspirant, a beginner, you bowed before the higher student who was perhaps in the second degree. And if you're in the second degree, you submitted yourself to those who were in the third degree. You automatically recognized their state of consciousness as superior to your own, and you bowed before it, not by rules, but by the fact of your knowing. And so it was all the way up to the Master itself, and the Master ruled supreme, because everyone realized that the Master had attained a degree of Christhood not yet attained by the others. And so their allegiance, their loyalty, their obedience was based not on a rule, not on a regulation, but on a recognized state of consciousness. So it will be with everyone who attains the realization of this Christ of their own being, who touches it or is touched by it. Instantly they will be freed of a dependence on person, on thing, on circumstance and condition, and all life will be a cooperation. and yet an acknowledgement to those who are a step beyond where we may be at any given moment. Now, there is no limit to the depth of Christhood, and therefore there is no limit to your attainment. Any limitation would, of course, be our own limitation, that which we place on ourselves. Even as we advance in this work, if we permit ourselves to be taken from our meditations and contemplations by the busyness of our practice or student body or organizational activities, we will cheat ourselves. Regardless of the amounting of the outer activity, we must limit that by consciously removing ourselves from that activity for long enough periods to abide in our spiritual stillness. No one must ever allow their outer activity to grow to such an extent that it deprives them of their hours, days, weeks, and months of inner unfoldment. It is a very simple thing, after one has touched the center, to find their outer activity so great that the matter of gaining a fortune or fame is almost as simple as a twist of the wrist. But it is an indulgence in material prosperity, and it would soon take from us the spiritual gift which is worth far more than that which we would give up by not permitting the outer world, not even the outer spiritual world, to deprive us. The Master insisted on his 40 days in the mountains. The Master insisted on disappearing from the multitudes. So must we. We must insist on withdrawing from our families, from our friends, from our human obligations for those periods necessary to our inner development and unfoldment, and then we must discipline ourselves. Because after a while, the outer world accepts us at our value, our own evaluation, and permits us to have our time alone, but then comes the temptation when we have our time alone not to use it in the way in which it should be used. And you will see that one of the most difficult periods is to go through a time such as we have this morning, with nothing active in the outer world but the entire period devoted to inner reflection, inner contemplation, inner quiet, inner stillness, and with nothing to show for it in the outer world. Certainly nothing to show for it at the moment. But the fruitage of a morning like this morning will continue to appear for years to come, influencing not only our own lives, but the lives of all who touch us. And so it is that an hour or 2 hours of silent meditation, a contemplation, a communion with God, with no seeming object, with no purpose, with no desire for attainment of any kind, not even healing, that is the depth of the vision that opens up the inner experience to us, and in ever deepening quality. Let's try it again. Aloha.